May 7, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Wehrmacht units across Germany were surrendering to Allied forces in a choreographed collapse that had been negotiated at Reims just hours before. But in a makeshift detention facility outside the town of Attigliano in northern Italy, nobody was celebrating. The smell reached the American guards first. Not the smell of death exactly, though death was there. This was different. The sweet, sick odor of infected wounds left untreated for days. The acrid stench of dysentery in bodies too weak to make it to latrines. The chemical tang of fever sweat on unwashed skin. And underneath it all, something else. Fear. The kind of fear that becomes physical, that you can smell on people who believe they are going to die. Lieutenant Robert Chen, 24 years old from the 5th Army's Medical Corps, walked between rows of tents that had been erected in a wheat field 3 days earlier. The tents were standard issue, designed for soldiers, not for what the Americans had found when German forces in Italy surrendered. Inside those tents were women. Hundreds of them. German women. Luftwaffe auxiliaries, nurses, communications specialists, clerks. Non-combatants, technically, though the Geneva Conventions were unclear about how to classify female military personnel who weren't nurses but weren't soldiers either. Chen had been expecting prisoners. He'd processed German POWs before. Men who'd surrendered, who were tired and hungry but fundamentally intact. Men who understood the rituals of military surrender, who knew that capture by Americans meant survival, meant food and cigarettes and eventual repatriation. But these women were different. They weren't intact. And they didn't believe they were going to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first woman Chen examined was perhaps 19 years old. Her name was Greta something. He couldn't quite make out her surname through her sobbing. She sat on a camp cot shaking so violently that Chen initially thought she was having a seizure. But it wasn't seizure. It was terror. Pure, animal terror that made her whole body convulse. She kept saying the same phrase over and over in German. Wir werden alle sterben. Wir werden alle sterben. We're all going to die. We're all going to die. Chen didn't speak German fluently, but he'd picked up enough over months in Europe to understand. He tried to reassure her, told her through an interpreter that she was safe, that she was a prisoner of war, that she would be treated according to international law. She didn't believe him. She looked at him with eyes that had already accepted death and kept sobbing. It took Chen several minutes to get her calm enough to examine. When he finally did, he found what he was starting to realize was common among these prisoners. Infected lacerations on her feet from marching in boots that didn't fit. Signs of prolonged malnutrition, not starvation exactly, but months of inadequate rations. Dehydration severe enough that her lips were cracked and bleeding. And fear. Fear so profound it had become a medical condition in itself. The detention facility at Attigliano had been set up in a hurry. When German forces in Italy surrendered on May 2, 1945, the Allies suddenly had thousands of prisoners to process. Most were men, Wehrmacht soldiers who surrendered in organized units with their officers and could be moved to established POW camps. But mixed among them were these women. Military auxiliaries who'd been serving in administrative and support roles across northern Italy as German forces retreated. The problem was nobody quite knew what to do with them. The POW camp system was designed for men. The facilities, the security procedures, the logistics, all of it assumed male prisoners. Female prisoners were an edge case that the system hadn't really planned for. So they'd been separated from the male POWs and placed in this temporary facility while someone figured out the proper protocol. Chen walked between the tents making mental notes. The women were in bad shape. Not as bad as concentration camp survivors. He'd seen photographs from the camps in Germany and nothing could compare to that. But these women had been through something. The physical evidence was there in infected wounds and malnutrition and dehydration. But it was the psychological evidence that struck Chen hardest. These women believed they were going to die. Not feared it. Believed it. Accepted it as certainty. A woman in the next tent refused to let Chen examine her. She'd curled into a fetal position on her cot, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth. When the interpreter tried to explain that Chen was a doctor, that he was there to help, she started screaming. Not words, just screaming. The sound of someone who'd passed beyond language into pure expression of terror. Chen backed away. Forced examination would only traumatize her further. He made a note on his clipboard. Severe psychological distress. Possible psychotic break. Needs psychiatric evaluation. But they didn't have psychiatrists at Attigliano. They barely had enough medical supplies to treat physical wounds. By the end of his first day examining prisoners, Chen had seen dozens of women. The pattern was consistent. Physical deterioration from weeks of retreat and inadequate supplies. Infected wounds that should have been treated days ago. And universal, absolute terror. They all believed the Americans were going to kill them. Every single one. The ones who could articulate why through translators told stories that made Chen's stomach clench. They'd been told things by their own officers as German forces retreated. Told that the Americans executed prisoners. That Soviet forces raped and murdered German women, and Americans did the same, just more quietly. That surrender meant death, just slower and more painful than dying in combat. The propaganda had worked. These women, educated women who'd served in technical and administrative roles, who should have known better, believed completely that they were facing execution. Some had tried to kill themselves before surrender. Chen found evidence of suicide attempts. Slashed wrists that had been bandaged poorly. Overdoses of whatever medications they could find. One woman had tried to hang herself with a communications wire and been cut down by an American soldier who'd found her. Chen reported to his commanding officer that evening. Major William Foster, a career Army medical officer who'd served since North Africa, listened to Chen's assessment with increasing concern. They had a facility full of women who were physically ill and psychologically broken. Women who believed they were about to be murdered and were too traumatized to accept reassurance. We need to get them medical treatment, Chen said. Real medical treatment. Not just field dressing wounds. They need proper facilities, antibiotics, psychiatric care. And they need to believe they're not going to die. Foster nodded slowly. He'd been thinking the same thing. But resources were limited. The war in Europe had just ended. The focus was on processing German POWs, repatriating Allied prisoners, dealing with millions of displaced persons across Europe. A few hundred German women in northern Italy weren't a priority for high command. I'll send a request up the chain, Foster said. But don't expect much. We're stretched thin as it is. The request went up through channels. 5th Army to 15th Army Group to Allied Force Headquarters. A request for medical supplies and personnel to treat several hundred female German POWs at a temporary facility in northern Italy. In the chaos of immediate post-war Europe, it should have been lost in the shuffle, forgotten in the flood of more pressing needs. But something unusual happened. Someone in the chain of command actually read the report carefully. Read Chen's detailed medical assessments. Read the descriptions of women so traumatized they couldn't stop screaming. And that someone made a decision. The decision came back down the chain within 48 hours. Not just approval for medical supplies. Orders to establish a proper medical facility. A field hospital, staffed with doctors and nurses, equipped to handle both physical and psychological trauma. And resources to build it quickly. Chen couldn't believe it when Foster told him. They're sending us what? He asked. Everything we asked for, Foster said, looking at the orders with something close to disbelief himself. Medical personnel, supplies, equipment to set up a full field hospital, and engineers to build proper facilities. Why? Chen asked. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's what they need. But why would High Command prioritize this? Foster shrugged. The orders came from pretty high up. Someone decided these women deserved treatment. Someone decided that even if they're enemy combatants, even if they believed propaganda about us, we're going to show them they were wrong. We're going to treat them like human beings. The engineers arrived first. Army Corps of Engineers personnel who'd spent the war building bridges and clearing roads and constructing temporary facilities. They surveyed the wheat field where the tents stood and started planning. The tents would be replaced with proper structures. Wooden frames with canvas walls that could be heated, that had floors to keep patients off the dirt, that had space for medical equipment and supplies. Within a week, the transformation was visible. The temporary detention facility was becoming something else. A hospital. Not a prison. Not a POW camp. A hospital. The women watched the construction with confusion that gradually shifted towards something that might have been hope, though they seemed afraid to let themselves feel it. Chen and the other medical personnel who'd arrived worked on gaining the women's trust while construction continued. It was slow work. Years of propaganda couldn't be undone in days. The women had been taught that Americans were cruel, that surrender meant torture and death. Every interaction had to chip away at that belief carefully. A nurse named Margaret Sullivan from Pennsylvania had more success than the male doctors. The women seemed less terrified of her. She could examine them without triggering the same panic response. She started teaching them English phrases. Simple things. I am thirsty. I need help. My name is. Creating small connections through language. One woman, an older auxiliary named Helga who'd served as a typist in Wehrmacht headquarters, started talking to Sullivan after several days. Through an interpreter, she explained what they'd been told during the retreat. That the Americans and British were as brutal as the Soviets. That prisoners would be worked to death or executed outright. That German women specifically would be raped and then killed. That surrender was not salvation but a different form of death. We believed it, Helga said quietly. We believed every word. Because why would our officers lie to us? Why would they tell us these things if they weren't true? Sullivan didn't have a good answer to that. How do you explain propaganda to someone who'd been raised in a propaganda state? How do you tell someone that their own government lied to them systematically for years? You couldn't. Not directly. You could only show them through actions that the propaganda was false. The field hospital was completed by late May 1945. It wasn't elaborate. Wooden structures with canvas roofs, heated by field stoves, equipped with the basic necessities of medical care. But it was clean. It was organized. It had beds with actual mattresses, not just camp cots. It had medical supplies in quantity. And it had staff whose only job was to treat the women as patients, not as prisoners. The transfer from the tents to the hospital buildings happened over 2 days. The women were moved in small groups, examined thoroughly, assigned to wards based on their medical needs. The physical treatment was straightforward. Antibiotics for infections. For fluids for dehydration. Proper bandaging for wounds. Adequate food, though carefully monitored because bodies that had been malnourished needed to be refed slowly. The psychological treatment was harder. Chen and Foster requisitioned a military psychiatrist, Captain David Rosen, who'd been treating combat trauma cases in frontline units. Rosen walked through the hospital wards and quickly realized this was different from combat trauma. These women hadn't experienced battle. They'd experienced something else. A systematic destruction of their ability to trust, to believe in their own survival, to see a future beyond death. They're presenting with symptoms similar to what we see in soldiers with severe combat fatigue, Rosen explained to the medical staff. But the cause is different. This is induced trauma. They were deliberately taught to fear surrender. And now they're experiencing cognitive dissonance. What they're seeing doesn't match what they were taught to expect. The treatment protocol Rosen developed was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Consistent positive reinforcement. Show the women through actions, not words, that they were safe. Feed them regularly. Treat their medical conditions. Speak to them with respect. Create an environment so contrary to what they'd been taught to expect that their beliefs had to shift. It worked slowly. Over days and then weeks, the sobbing lessened. The screaming stopped. Women who'd been curled in fetal positions started sitting up, started eating voluntarily, started speaking to the medical staff without translators having to coax every word out of them. Greta, the young woman Chen had first examined, was one of the early successes. After 2 weeks of treatment, she could speak without crying. After 3 weeks, she smiled for the first time when Sullivan brought her extra rations. After a month, She was helping in the hospital, translating for women who spoke only German, assisting nurses with basic tasks. "I thought you were going to kill us," she told Chen one day. Her English had improved significantly. "I was certain. When you examined me that first day, I thought you were just checking to make sure I was healthy enough to execute." Chen didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone who believed you were planning to murder them? He settled for the truth. "We're doctors. We don't kill people. We treat them." "I know that now," Greta said. "But I didn't know it then." The field hospital at Attigliano operated through the summer of 1945. As the women recovered physically and psychologically, decisions had to be made about their long-term disposition. They couldn't stay indefinitely. Resources were needed elsewhere. Europe was slowly rebuilding, and medical personnel were in short supply. By August, most of the women were healthy enough for transfer to regular POW processing facilities. The infections had healed. The malnutrition had been corrected. The psychological trauma was still there but manageable. They no longer believed they were going to die. They understood that the Americans who'd captured them were treating them according to international law. Some even expressed gratitude, though the complexity of feeling grateful to an enemy who defeated your nation was difficult for many of them to process. The hospital was dismantled as quickly as it had been built. The wooden structures were repurposed for other needs. The medical staff were reassigned to other duties. By September, the wheat field outside Attigliano showed little evidence that anything unusual had happened there. Just some cleared ground and the memory of several hundred women who'd believed they were going to die and instead received medical care. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The decision to build that hospital, to prioritize medical treatment for enemy prisoners who'd been taught to see Americans as murderers, came from somewhere in the command structure. The records don't clearly indicate who specifically made the call. It might have been a medical officer who'd read Chen's reports and understood the urgency. It might have been a higher-ranking commander who saw an opportunity to demonstrate American values through action. It might have been multiple people in the chain making small decisions that accumulated into a larger policy. Whoever made the decision understood something important. These women weren't just enemy prisoners. They were evidence. Evidence of what propaganda could do. Evidence of how thoroughly a regime could poison the minds of its own people. And evidence that such poisoning could be treated, that belief systems built on lies could be challenged with truth demonstrated through actions. The American military in 1945 had a lot of priorities. Processing millions of POWs. Repatriating Allied prisoners from German camps. Managing displaced persons across Europe. Beginning the occupation of Germany. Starting war crimes trials. Dealing with massive logistical challenges of feeding and housing populations in devastated countries. In that context, several hundred female German auxiliaries in northern Italy should have been a footnote, a minor administrative issue to be resolved with minimal resources. But someone decided they deserved more than minimal resources. Someone decided that how America treated these women mattered. Not for strategic reasons. Not for propaganda value, though that would come later. But because it was the right thing to do. Because even enemy prisoners who'd been taught to hate you deserved medical care. Because showing mercy to those who expected cruelty was more powerful than any propaganda broadcast. The women at Attigliano weren't the only female German POWs in American custody in the spring and summer of 1945. Across Germany and Austria, as the Wehrmacht collapsed, American forces captured thousands of women who'd served in military auxiliary roles. Luftwaffe signal operators, Wehrmacht administrative personnel, nurses, radio operators, clerks. Women who'd kept the German military functioning even as it retreated and disintegrated. The treatment of these prisoners varied. Some American units, overwhelmed with male POWs and focused on security, placed female prisoners in whatever facilities were available with minimal regard for their specific needs. Some units, uncertain about protocol for female POWs, simply released them, told them to go home if they had homes to go to. The official policy was still being formulated in the chaos of immediate post-war Europe. But at Attigliano and at several other locations where American medical personnel encountered groups of female POWs in dire condition, the response was similar. Build facilities. Provide treatment. Show through actions that the propaganda they'd believed was false. The pattern emerged not from top-down orders but from individual decisions by medical officers and unit commanders who saw suffering and chose to address it. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hartmann, a nurse who'd served with the Army Nurse Corps since North Africa, encountered a group of approximately 150 German women near Salzburg, Austria in early May 1945. They'd been captured by elements of the Third Army and were being held in a former Wehrmacht barracks that had been bombed and was barely habitable. No heat, no running water, minimal food. Hartmann walked into that barracks and found conditions that reminded her uncomfortably of photographs she'd seen from the concentration camps. Not as extreme, but the same architecture of neglect. Women sleeping on floors, sharing thin blankets, too weak or too frightened to ask for help. She immediately went to the commanding officer of the unit holding them. "We need to move them," she told Colonel Frank Morrison, the 3rd Army officer responsible for POW processing in that sector. "Those conditions are unacceptable." Morrison looked at her with frustration. "I've got 15,000 male POWs to process. I don't have facilities for women. I don't have female guards. I barely have enough food for the men. These women are low priority." "They are human beings," Hartmann said. "And they are in our custody. That makes them our responsibility." Morrison sighed. He was a good officer, not cruel, just overwhelmed. "What do you want me to do? I can't conjure facilities out of thin air." "You have engineers," Hartmann said. "You have medical supplies. You have personnel. Build something. Make it work. Because right now, those women are dying, and we're going to be responsible for their deaths." Morrison made some calls. Within days, engineers were constructing a facility similar to what had been built at Attigliano. Hartmann supervised the medical treatment, bringing in nurses and doctors, establishing protocols for dealing with malnutrition and infection and trauma. The women in Salzburg responded the same way the women at Attigliano had. Disbelief gradually giving way to cautious trust, terror slowly replaced by something approaching hope. These individual decisions by officers like Morrison and medical personnel like Hartmann and Chen created a pattern that eventually became policy. By June 1945, the European Theatre of Operations had issued formal guidelines for handling female POWs. Separate facilities, adequate medical care, female guards where available, treatment consistent with Geneva Conventions. The guidelines formalized what had already been happening informally in places like Attigliano and Salzburg. But the psychological damage the propaganda had inflicted took longer to heal than physical wounds. The women had been taught systematically to fear surrender. The propaganda wasn't subtle. It was explicit, detailed, designed to terrify. Stories of Soviet atrocities in the East, true stories often, were presented as evidence of what all allies would do. Stories of American brutality, often fabricated or exaggerated, were distributed through military channels and civilian media. A woman named Liesel, a communications specialist who'd served in northern Italy, explained it to Captain Rosen during one of his psychiatric evaluations. "They showed us photographs," she said. Her English was hesitant but understandable. Photographs of German women who'd been captured by the Soviets. What had been done to them? And they told us the Americans were the same, just better at hiding it. That you would smile while you hurt us. Why did you believe it? Rosen asked, genuinely curious. Liesel looked at him like the question was absurd. Why wouldn't we believe it? It came from our officers. It was in the newspapers. Everyone said it. And we'd seen what happened in the East. We knew the Soviets were brutal. Why would the Americans be different? It was a rational question, actually. The propaganda had built on a foundation of truth. Soviet treatment of German civilians and POWs in the East had been brutal. The rage of Soviet soldiers, who'd seen what German forces did in Russia, who'd liberated death camps and destroyed villages, manifested in violence against Germans. The stories from the East were real. The propaganda simply extended that reality to all Allied forces. breaking that belief required more than words. It required sustained demonstration that the Americans were, in fact, different. That the promises of Geneva Convention treatment were real. That medical care would be provided. That food would come regularly. That guards wouldn't assault prisoners. That the hospital at Attigliano or Salzburg or the dozen other facilities that had been established wasn't a trap but genuine care. The transformation happened at different rates for different women. Some, like Greta, adapted quickly, their natural optimism reasserting itself once the immediate fear faded. Others remained skeptical for months, waiting for the cruelty they'd been promised to manifest. A few never fully recovered from the trauma, the fear too deeply embedded to be completely removed. But most of the women, given time and consistent treatment, came to understand that what they'd been taught was false. The Americans weren't brutal. They weren't hiding cruelty behind smiles. They were, for the most part, young men and women who'd been taught to treat prisoners according to certain standards and who followed those standards even when it was inconvenient, even when the prisoners were enemy combatants who'd supported a regime that had committed atrocities. The contrast with what was happening in other parts of occupied Europe was stark. Soviet treatment of German POWs, male and female, was harsh. Years of forced labor in Soviet camps. Minimal medical care. High mortality rates. The Soviets had no interest in demonstrating mercy to Germans. Their own losses had been too great. The suffering the German invasion had inflicted too severe. Soviet treatment of German prisoners was retribution, and while it violated Geneva Conventions, it was understandable given what Soviet forces had witnessed liberating their own territory. British treatment of German POWs was generally consistent with Geneva Conventions but less focused on psychological care than American treatment. The British had their own war-shattered populations to care for. German prisoners were fed, housed, treated adequately, but there wasn't the same emphasis on demonstrating through action that pre-war propaganda was false. The American approach, visible at places like Attigliano, was unusual. Not because American forces were uniquely moral. Every army had units that violated conventions, soldiers who committed crimes, commanders who looked the other way. But there was something in American military culture, perhaps stemming from the relatively short American involvement in the war, perhaps from American self-conception as liberators rather than conquerors, that manifested in a willingness to extend basic humanity even to enemy prisoners. The women noticed. Helga, the older typist who'd been among the first to start trusting the American medical staff, tried to explain it to Rosen one day. "We expected you to be like us," she said. "We thought all armies were the same. That everyone, when given power over prisoners, would abuse that power. Because that's what we saw. That's what our military did. But you're not like us," she continued. "You have rules, and you follow them. Even when it would be easier not to. Even when we're your enemies. I don't understand it, but I'm grateful for it." Rosen didn't know how to respond to that. How do you explain American exceptionalism to someone who'd been taught that Germany was exceptional? How do you talk about moral frameworks and cultural values when the woman you're talking to had supported, however passively, a regime that built death camps? He settled for acknowledging her observation without claiming moral superiority. "We try to follow our principles," he said. "We don't always succeed. But we try." The field hospital at Attigliano closed in September 1945, but its legacy extended beyond the women it treated. The medical personnel who served there carried the experience with them. Chen would later write about it in his memoirs, published in the 1980s. The moment when medicine became more than treating wounds, when it became a tool for challenging propaganda, for demonstrating through care that the enemy's beliefs about you were false. Foster, the commanding medical officer, used the Attigliano experience in lectures at military medical schools after the war. He taught that treating enemy prisoners wasn't just a legal obligation under Geneva Conventions. It was a strategic tool. Show your enemies that you will treat them humanely, and future enemies will be more willing to surrender. It saves lives on both sides. But beyond the strategic arguments was something simpler. The women at Attigliano had been human beings in medical distress. They'd been terrified, injured, sick. And the American response had been to build a hospital, to provide care, to demonstrate through actions that their fears were unfounded. It was, in its own way, a small victory in the larger war against the ideology that had produced such fears. The women who passed through Attigliano and similar facilities were eventually repatriated to Germany. The process took months, sometimes over a year, as the Allied occupation authorities established screening procedures and processed millions of displaced persons and POWs. But by late 1946, most had been released and returned to whatever remained of their homes. Greta returned to Hamburg, which had been devastated by Allied bombing. She found her family's apartment building destroyed, her parents living in a displaced persons camp. She got a job with the Allied Occupation Administration, translating documents, using her English skills. In interviews years later, she would talk about Attigliano, about the American hospital, about the moment she realized she wasn't going to die. "They saved my life," she said in a documentary filmed in the 1990s. "Not just my physical life, though the medical treatment did that. They saved me from the belief that the world was nothing but cruelty. They showed me that even in war, even between enemies, there could be humanity." Liesel, the communications specialist, went back to Bavaria. She became a teacher, teaching English to German children in the new Federal Republic. She kept in touch with some of the American nurses who'd treated her, exchanging letters for decades. When asked about her experience, she would say that the hospital at Attigliano taught her more about democracy than any political science lecture could have. "Democracy isn't just a system of government," she said. "It's a way of treating people. Even people who are your enemies. Even people who believed terrible things about you. You show them through your actions what your values really are." Helga, the older typist, didn't survive long after repatriation. She'd been weakened by the years of war and inadequate nutrition, and pneumonia killed her in the harsh winter of 1946, before antibiotics became widely available in occupied Germany. But before she died, she wrote a letter to Lieutenant Chen, thanking him for his care. The letter, preserved in Chen's papers, included a line that stayed with him. "You treated us like we were worth saving, at a time when we didn't believe we were worth anything at all." The story of what happened at Attigliano and similar facilities wasn't widely publicized at the time. It wasn't dramatic enough for headlines. No battles, no liberation moments, no clear villains or heroes. Just medical personnel doing their jobs, treating patients who happened to be enemy prisoners. Just engineers building facilities, just administrators allocating resources, just translators helping communication, just guards maintaining security without brutality. But in the aggregate, in the thousands of small decisions to provide care rather than neglect, to build hospitals rather than leave prisoners in inadequate facilities, to treat trauma rather than ignore it, the American military demonstrated something important. That even in the chaos of immediate post-war Europe, even with millions of pressing demands, even when dealing with enemy combatants who'd believed propaganda about American brutality, the response could be humane. It wasn't universal. There were American units that treated POWs poorly, commanders who didn't care about conditions, guards who abused prisoners. The American military wasn't perfect. But there was enough humanity in the system, enough commanders willing to allocate resources for medical care, enough medical personnel willing to advocate for their patients regardless of nationality, that places like Attigliano could exist. The women who sobbed "We're all going to die" in May 1945 were wrong. They didn't die. They were treated. They recovered, physically and psychologically. They were repatriated. They rebuilt lives in a Germany that was itself being rebuilt. And many of them carried for the rest of their lives a memory of the moment when their beliefs about the enemy were shattered by the simple act of medical care. That memory, multiplied across thousands of former prisoners, became part of the post-war reconciliation between Germany and the United States. It wasn't the main factor. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the shared confrontation with the Soviet Union, all those played larger roles. But at the individual level, in personal stories and family histories, the memory of humane treatment mattered. It created a foundation of trust that larger political reconciliation could build on. Lieutenant Chen, reflecting on Attigliano in his memoir, wrote about the day the hospital closed. The last group of women were being transferred to a regular POW processing center. They were healthy now, well-fed, their wounds healed. They lined up to board trucks, and as they did, many of them shook hands with the American medical staff. Some hugged the nurses who'd treated them. Some cried, not from fear this time, but from gratitude and the complex emotions of leaving a place where they'd been treated with unexpected kindness. I realized in that moment, Chen wrote, that we'd won something more important than a military victory. We'd won a victory over propaganda. We'd shown those women that what they'd been taught to believe about us was false. And in doing so, we'd demonstrated what America, at its best, could be. Not perfect, not without flaws, but fundamentally decent. Fundamentally committed to treating people humanely, even when they're your enemies. Even when it would be easier to look away. The field hospital that shouldn't have been built, that existed because someone in the chain of command decided several hundred terrified women deserved medical care, operated for approximately 4 months. In that time, it treated over 400 patients. It saved lives that malnutrition and infection would have claimed. It provided psychiatric care that helped traumatized women begin to process what they'd experienced. And it demonstrated through thousands of small acts of care that the propaganda about American brutality was false. It wasn't a concentration camp liberation. It wasn't a dramatic battlefield victory. It was just a hospital in a wheat field in northern Italy, staffed by American medical personnel who treated German prisoners according to Geneva Conventions and beyond, who saw suffering and chose to address it, who understood that how you treat your enemies says more about you than how you treat your friends. The women who passed through Attigliano went on to live ordinary lives in post-war Germany. They raised children, rebuilt communities, participated in the economic miracle of the Federal Republic. Most of them never became famous. Their stories weren't recorded in history books. They were just individuals who'd experienced a small moment of humanity in a war that had been defined by inhumanity. But they remembered. They told their children and grandchildren about the American hospital, about the doctors who treated them, about the moment when they realized they weren't going to die. Those stories became part of family histories, small threads in the larger tapestry of German-American reconciliation. And the American medical personnel who served at Attigliano remembered too. They carried the experience through the rest of their careers and lives. They taught the lessons they'd learned to new generations of military medical personnel. They testified to the importance of treating all patients with dignity, regardless of nationality or the circumstances of how they became patients. Major Foster, in his post-war lectures, would always include a section on Attigliano. Medicine in wartime, he would say, is about more than treating wounds. It's about maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. It's about seeing patients as human beings, even when everything around you is screaming that they're the enemy. The women at Attigliano were enemy combatants who'd supported a regime that built death camps. But when they came to us injured and terrified, they were patients. And we treated them as patients. That's what military medicine means. The decision to build that hospital, to allocate resources to treating female German POWs when those resources could have gone elsewhere, was never fully documented. The records don't show a clear chain of command decision. It seems to have emerged from multiple people making parallel choices. Medical officers requesting supplies. Engineers willing to build facilities. Commanders approving resource allocation. Administrative personnel processing requisitions. All of them, independently and collectively, deciding that these women deserved treatment. It was democracy in action, in a way. Not democracy as a voting system, but democracy as a cultural value. The belief that every individual has worth, that power comes with responsibility to those under your power, that how you treat the powerless reveals your true character. These weren't uniquely American values, but they were values that American military culture in 1945 took seriously enough that a field hospital could be built for enemy prisoners in the chaos of immediate post-war Europe. The wheat field outside Attigliano is farmland again now. No marker indicates what happened there. No monument commemorates the field hospital that operated for 4 months in the summer of 1945. The buildings were dismantled decades ago. The women who were treated there are mostly gone now. The youngest would be in their 90s. The American medical personnel who staffed it have passed away. But the story remains. Preserved in memoirs like Chen's, in interviews recorded for oral history projects, in family stories passed down through generations. The story of women who believed they were going to die and instead received medical care. The story of American medical personnel who saw suffering and chose to address it. The story of a moment when humanity asserted itself in the midst of war's aftermath. It wasn't the most important story of World War II. It wasn't the most dramatic. But it was real. It happened. And it mattered to the women who lived through it, who carried the memory of that unexpected mercy for the rest of their lives. It mattered to the American personnel who demonstrated through their actions what their nation's values meant in practice. And it matters to history as an example of what's possible when individuals choose humanity over expedience, when they see suffering and refuse to look away. The women at Attigliano sobbed that they were all going to die. They were certain of it, taught by propaganda to expect only cruelty from their captors. But they were wrong. They didn't die. They lived because someone decided to build them a hospital, to provide them care, to show them through actions that the propaganda was false. That single decision, replicated at facilities across occupied Europe, helped begin the long process of reconciliation, of rebuilding trust, of moving past the hatred that war had cultivated. It was a small victory in the larger arc of history, but to the women who experienced it, it was everything. It was the difference between death and life, between despair and hope, between believing the world was only cruelty and understanding that even in war, humanity could persist. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.